The moving truck had barely rolled to a stop when I saw her. The woman in the pastel tracksuit with the expression of someone who thought she was mayor of the block. She didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't even look curious. She just stood at the edge of the curb with her arms crossed like I'd just violated international law by daring to arrive. The first words out of her mouth weren't welcome or hello, but "You can't park there." I almost laughed. The driver was still lowering the ramp, my furniture hadn't even touched the ground, and already I'd stepped into a battle I didn't sign up for. The irony was, this wasn't even her territory. My house sat on the very edge of the subdivision, technically outside of the HOA's governing reach. I had double-checked before buying it. The real estate agent, the county clerk, even the HOA's own boundary map, all confirmed I was in a sweet spot of freedom. I had watched enough neighborhood horror stories to know better than to buy inside the clutches of an HOA. But apparently, Karen, the woman now glaring at me like I had parked a nuclear missile on her lawn, hadn't gotten that memo. "You must be new," she said, her voice coated with the same syrupy condescension teachers reserve for slow students. "I'm Karen, president of the HOA." She pointed at the street in front of my driveway, as though I didn't know what a street was. "This entire road falls under my jurisdiction, so you'll need to clear that moving truck right now. It's blocking traffic." I turned, surveyed the vast, empty street. Not a single car was trying to pass. The only sound was a distant lawnmower somewhere down the block. "Traffic," I echoed, then looked back at her. "Right. I'll keep an eye out for rush hour." Her eyes narrowed. Sarcasm wasn't the tribute she wanted, but I wasn't about to start paying taxes to the Church of Karen. The movers didn't even glance her way, which told me they'd dealt with her type before. I shrugged and motioned toward my house. "Anyway, thanks for the warm welcome. I'll be sure to wave at your jurisdiction on my way in." That should have been the end of it, but Karen was the type who smelled blood in every conversation. She followed me up the driveway, lecturing about community standards, neighborhood property values, and the rules that everyone had to follow. I let her talk until we reached my front porch. Then I turned, leveled my voice, and said, "You're mistaken. This property isn't in your HOA. Check your bylaws." Her mouth opened, then closed again. For a moment I saw the flicker of doubt. But entitlement is a stubborn parasite, and within seconds she was back in full form. "That doesn't matter," she snapped. "This street belongs to the community. I won't have outsiders dragging down the neighborhood." "Outsiders," I repeated. "You make it sound like I crossed a border." Karen didn't even flinch. "If you want to live here, you'll need to attend our monthly meetings. And I expect you to submit a landscaping plan by next week." The sheer audacity almost made me choke on my own laughter. Here was a woman trying to annex me into her little kingdom by sheer force of will. But instead of arguing, I just smiled. "Sure," I said. "I'll draw up a landscaping plan. I've been thinking about installing a few concrete gargoyles with glowing eyes. You think that'll pass your standards?" Her face twisted like she'd swallowed lemon juice. She spun on her heel and stormed off without another word. For a brief moment I thought I'd won. I thought maybe she'd realize I wasn't worth the effort. But the way she stalked down the street, muttering to herself, told me this wasn't the last I'd see of her. The rest of the day passed in a blur of boxes, sweat, and furniture assembly. The movers left, and I stood on my porch with a beer, enjoying the quiet. That's when I noticed Karen again. She was across the street this time, holding court with two other neighbors. Every so often she'd gesture in my direction, her voice carrying just enough for me to catch fragments. "Wrong type of people, property values, rules are rules." Her friends nodded like parishioners. One of them, a tall man with suspenders, squinted at me like I was already guilty of a crime. I raised my beer in a mock salute. Karen turned her back immediately. The message was clear. I had been marked. The next morning, a letter appeared taped to my front door. No envelope, no stamp, just a single sheet of printer paper. It had the HOA's logo at the top, an acorn tree surrounded by a wreath, and a list of violations. Apparently, I was in breach of community guidelines for leaving my trash bins visible, failing to submit a mailbox design for approval, and not trimming the hedge along my driveway. Never mind that the trash bins hadn't even been picked up yet, the mailbox was the exact one installed by the builder, and the hedge was 3 feet tall at most. I read it twice, then laughed out loud. Karen had officially declared war. That evening, I walked the property line with the plat map from the county's website in hand. Sure enough, my lot stopped just short of the HOA boundary. My mailbox, my driveway, even the slice of street directly in front of my house, all outside her jurisdiction. I could plant neon palm trees in the yard, and there wasn't a thing she could do about it. That thought alone was more refreshing than the beer I cracked open afterward. But Karen wasn't one to be deterred by fact. The next day, I came home to find a second letter, this time warning me about improperly parked vehicles. My truck was sitting neatly in my own driveway. She had underlined the phrase, "community safety hazard," 3 times in red ink. I decided to test the waters. That weekend, I bought a set of lawn flamingos, bright pink, obnoxiously cheerful, the kind you couldn't miss from a mile away. I planted them in a neat little row along the edge of my yard. By sundown, Karen was back at my door, banging so hard I thought the hinges would give out. "You can't do this," she shrieked before I even opened the door fully. "This is against the rules." I leaned on the frame, keeping my expression perfectly calm. "What rules, exactly? Because last I checked, your HOA doesn't cover this property." Her face went red. She sputtered, searching for an argument, before finally settling on, "It lowers the tone of the neighborhood." I smiled. "That's funny. I thought they raised it." She stormed off again, muttering something about bringing it up with the board. That was when I realized she wasn't just posturing. She was going to drag her entire HOA army into this fight, and she wouldn't stop until she felt she'd won. By Monday morning, my suspicions were confirmed. I returned from work to find a notice taped to my garage door. This one claimed that my property was subject to HOA oversight due to adjacency, and threatened fines if I didn't comply. The legal jargon was a mess, but the intent was clear. Karen was rewriting the rules as she went, hoping I'd fold under pressure. Instead, I poured another beer, sat on the porch, and waited. Because if Karen wanted a war, I was more than willing to play the long game. And something told me, she hadn't even shown her craziest hand yet. What she didn't know was that I had a few cards of my own. And I was just patient enough to wait until she overplayed hers. The next weekend started like any other. I was unpacking boxes in the garage, sorting tools into neat drawers, when a sound carried through the quiet cul-de-sac, the crunch of gravel under too many feet. I looked up to see Karen marching toward my driveway, flanked by 3 other HOA board members like she was leading a parade of authority. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like a crown, she looked every bit the general preparing to declare battle. The tallest of her companions carried a camera, already clicking away as though my hedges and driveway were crime scenes. Karen didn't bother with greetings this time. "We've voted," she announced, thrusting a folded sheet of paper at me. "By unanimous decision, this property is now under HOA jurisdiction due to its proximity and the need for uniform community standards." I didn't take the paper. Instead, I leaned against the hood of my truck, arms crossed, and raised an eyebrow. "You voted," I repeated slowly. "Let me guess, you for?" She nodded sharply. "Yes. The board. It's binding." The absurdity was almost elegant. 4 neighbors had apparently rewritten property law over brunch and figured I'd roll over in awe. I let out a low whistle. "That's adorable. But unless you've suddenly become the county zoning board, your little vote has the legal weight of a monopoly card." Her face twitched. She gestured toward the man with the camera. "Document it," she ordered. He snapped another picture of my trash bins. Then she turned back to me. "You'll be receiving official violation notices starting Monday. If you continue to resist, We'll fine you daily until you comply. Now, I've played enough poker to know when someone's bluffing. Karen's tone had the brittle edge of someone who wasn't sure if their hand was strong enough but was too stubborn to fold. I gave her a smile so calm it must have infuriated her. You do that. But you might want to check with a lawyer before you start handing out monopoly money. For a moment, silence hung between us, thick as humidity before a storm. Then Karen huffed, spun on her heel, and led her parade back down the street. Her army didn't look half as confident as she did. That night, I poured myself another beer on the porch, waiting to see what she'd pull next. It didn't take long. Monday morning, as promised, a bright orange slip was taped to my front door. It cited me for failure to maintain landscaping, non-compliant mailbox, and unsightly decorative features, the flamingos. Each violation carried a $200 fine. I almost admired her commitment. She was building an entire bureaucracy out of thin air, complete with stationery and printed forms. The problem was, she'd forgotten one crucial thing. I actually knew how to read legal documents. And unlike Karen, I didn't confuse a self-important vote with an enforceable ordinance. So, instead of ignoring her, I decided to play along. I wrote a letter on official county clerk letterhead I'd downloaded online, citing chapter and verse of the subdivision boundaries. In it, I politely informed the HOA that any attempt to enforce rules on my property would constitute harassment and that further action could be met with legal consequences. Then I signed it with a flourish, dropped it in Karen's mailbox, and waited. The explosion was visible the next morning. I was sipping coffee at the window when I saw Karen march into the cul-de-sac, letter crumpled in her fist, shrieking at her board members. The tall guy with the camera looked like he wanted to melt into the asphalt. Within hours, another letter appeared at my door, this one in all caps. Cease and desist illegal threats against the HOA. It was spiraling beautifully. Every move she made, I countered with calm precision. The more she flailed, the more unhinged she appeared. The neighbors were starting to notice too. I caught snippets of conversations when I walked my dog, words like overstepping and power trip. Still, Karen wasn't done. Her next escalation came in the form of a pickup truck loaded with landscaping equipment. I pulled into my driveway one afternoon to find 2 hired workers already trimming my hedge without asking. When I confronted them, one shrugged and said, "The HOA hired us." I almost laughed. "You're trespassing," I said flatly. "I suggest you pack up before I call the sheriff." The workers hesitated, then glanced at each other. Karen, standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, shouted, "Don't listen to him. He has no authority here. This is HOA property." That was my breaking point. I pulled out my phone and dialed the non-emergency sheriff's line. Within 20 minutes, a deputy pulled up, lights flashing. Karen ran to intercept him, waving her arms and rattling off a tirade about community safety. But the deputy held up a hand, asked for my side, then asked to see my deed. When I showed him the plat map and boundary line, his eyebrows rose. He turned to Karen. "Ma'am, this property isn't under HOA jurisdiction. You can't enforce rules here." Karen's face crumpled like a paper bag. But the street. The street belongs to us." The deputy shook his head. "No, ma'am. This is county property. If you or your contractors step onto his land again, it'll be considered trespassing." Karen looked like she might combust right there on the sidewalk. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. Her board members hovered awkwardly behind her, suddenly very interested in their shoes. The workers quietly packed up and drove away. The deputy gave me a nod. "Call us again if there's any more trouble." Then he left, leaving Karen standing there with her fists balled and her entire empire cracking around her. I thought that might be the end, but Karen's kind doesn't retreat. They regroup. And sure enough, the very next day, a new tactic emerged. A petition circulated through the neighborhood, declaring that my property should be annexed into the HOA for the good of the community. Copies of it landed in every mailbox, each with Karen's signature at the bottom and a list of grievances against me, most of them laughable. Apparently, my truck was an eyesore, my lawn flamingos a threat to neighborhood values, and my mere presence divisive. The funny thing? Neighbors started coming up to me, petition in hand, rolling their eyes. "She's lost it," one man whispered. "Don't worry, we're not signing." Another neighbor, a woman with 2 kids, muttered, "I'm sick of her. She's been bossing us around for years." That was when it hit me. Karen had been running her little HOA fiefdom unchecked for so long that no one had ever pushed back. My refusal to bend wasn't just annoying her, it was cracking the illusion of power she'd spent years building. Of course, Karen didn't see it that way. In her mind, the only explanation was that I was corrupting her subjects. That Friday night, I caught her pacing in front of my house, phone pressed to her ear, ranting loudly enough for me to hear. "He's poisoning the community, undermining everything we've built. Yes, we'll take legal action." I leaned on my porch railing, beer in hand, and called out, "Be sure to use real lawyers this time. Monopoly doesn't count." She spun, her face twisted with fury, then stormed back to her house. That weekend, my flamingos mysteriously vanished. I found the plastic legs snapped and tossed into my trash bins. I didn't need a detective to figure out who had done it. But instead of confronting her, I set up a motion-activated camera on the porch. Because if Karen wanted to play dirty, I'd be ready. It was close to midnight when the motion camera went off for the first time. A faint ping on my phone jolted me from half-sleep, and I padded over to the window to look. There she was, Karen, queen of the HOA, tiptoeing across my lawn in slippers with a flashlight clutched like a weapon. She crouched at the edge of my driveway, peering at my hedges like she was uncovering state secret. For several minutes she paced back and forth, muttering, occasionally scribbling notes on her clipboard. Then she turned, aimed her flashlight directly at my camera, and scowled before vanishing into the night. The footage was clear as day. Karen had officially graduated from petty harassment to late-night trespassing. The next morning, I emailed the video to myself, saving multiple copies, then poured coffee on the porch like nothing had happened. When Karen walked by on her morning inspection, I lifted my phone and waved it casually. She froze mid-step, then quickened her pace down the sidewalk without a word. For the first time, I saw genuine unease flicker across her face. By that afternoon, she'd escalated again. A glossy flyer appeared in every mailbox on the street. The header screamed in bold letters, "Community alert, unsafe neighbor next door." The body of the text painted me as a dangerous influence, a troublemaker, even a threat to children. She claimed I had verbally threatened HOA officials, intimidated workers with violence, and installed surveillance equipment to spy on neighbors. At the bottom was her signature, flanked by the HOA board's names. I held the flyer in my hands, marveling at the creativity. It was slander, plain and simple, but she had distributed it with the self-righteous confidence of a politician. I half expected her to start holding press conferences on her front lawn. What Karen hadn't counted on was my patience. Instead of storming over, I quietly tucked the flyer into a folder marked, "Evidence." The neighbors weren't buying it either. That evening, my doorbell rang, and the woman with 2 kids from down the street stood there holding the flyer. "This is insane," she said, shaking her head. "We all know it's her. Don't let it get to you." She hesitated, then leaned in conspiratorially. "If you ever need someone to testify, I've seen her do worse." That was the moment I realized the tide was turning. Karen wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was unraveling in front of the whole neighborhood. Still, she had one more ace up her sleeve, or at least she thought she did. A week later, I came home from work to find a county vehicle parked out front. 2 code enforcement officers were snapping photos of my yard. My heart sank for a moment before I approached them. "Afternoon, gentlemen," I said. "Problem?" One of them frowned at his clipboard. We've received multiple complaints about unpermitted construction and safety hazards on this property. I blinked. Construction? Unless you count flamingos as a new wing of the house, I think you've got the wrong idea. The officer glanced at the yard, clearly puzzled. The report mentioned a non-compliant structure and hazardous decorations. I couldn't help laughing. Hazardous flamingos? You're kidding. The officers weren't amused, but after a thorough check, they left empty-handed, muttering about false complaints wasting their time. I didn't need a detective to know who'd filed them. Sure enough, that night Karen cornered me as I took the trash out. "Don't think this is over," she hissed. "You might have tricked the sheriff, but I have contacts downtown. You'll regret making me look foolish." Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the manic energy of someone who knew they were losing control. I tilted my head and said softly, "Karen, the only person making you look foolish is you." Then I walked away, leaving her sputtering in the dark. But Karen wasn't the type to retreat. A few days later, I discovered her boldest stunt yet. As I was driving home, I noticed fresh paint on the pavement at the entrance of the street. Big, white block letters. Private road, HOA members only. At the bottom, a smaller stencil read, "Trespassers will be towed." I nearly drove off the road laughing. She had literally tried to claim the entire street like a medieval baroness drawing lines on a map. By the next morning, she had erected a temporary gate at the entrance, complete with orange cones and a folding sign that said, "Residents only." And, of course, she stationed herself in a lawn chair beside it like some self-appointed border guard. When I approached in my truck, she stood, blocking my path. "You can't enter," she declared. "This road belongs to the HOA. You're not welcome here." I rolled down the window. "Karen, if you don't move, I'm calling the sheriff again. You remember how that went last time, right?" Her lips curled into a triumphant smile. "Do it. They'll back me this time." She was dead wrong, and we both knew it. I inched the truck forward until she realized I wasn't bluffing. With a furious screech, she leapt out of the way, kicking over one of her cones. I drove past, calm as ever, while she screamed about lawsuits and disrespect. That night, I checked the footage from my camera. Sure enough, the gate and paint had been installed by Karen herself, with 2 of her bored lackeys helping. It was all on tape. The cones, the brushes, even Karen directing traffic like a wannabe construction foreman. Armed with evidence, I made another call to the county. Within 48 hours, a road crew arrived with power washers and repainted the street. They dismantled her makeshift gate and warned her about tampering with public property. Karen stood on her lawn the whole time, arms crossed, face purple with rage, muttering under her breath about conspiracies and outsiders ruining everything. I thought that humiliation might finally quiet her down. But Karen's mind didn't work like most people's. Being proven wrong didn't end the battle. It only convinced her that she needed bigger weapons. 2 days later, I was woken at dawn by the rumble of a tow truck idling in my driveway. I stumbled outside, barefoot and furious, to find a driver hooking chains to my truck. Karen stood on the sidewalk, triumphant. "Illegal vehicle," she declared. "We voted. It's being removed." The driver looked uncomfortable. She said she was the HOA president. He muttered when I demanded an explanation. I whipped out my deed and pointed to the plat line. "This property isn't under her authority. If you tow this truck, you'll be liable for trespassing and theft." The driver hesitated, scratching his head. Karen shrieked, "Don't listen to him. Tow it." That was when I pulled out my phone and hit record. "Sir, you understand that if you touch this vehicle, I'll have no choice but to press charges. The sheriff has already warned her once." The man swore under his breath, unhooked the chains, and drove off, leaving Karen screaming on the sidewalk. I filmed the whole thing, including her yelling, "I own this street," at the top of her lungs. That night, I uploaded the video to a private folder, shared it with a few neighbors, and sat back to watch the fallout. By the next day, half the street was buzzing. The phrase, "I own this street," had already become a running joke. One guy even chalked it onto the sidewalk in front of her house. It started with sirens. Not the faint background noise you get in a city, but the sharp, rising wail of squad cars tearing down the street like something out of a crime drama. I stepped out onto the porch just as two police cruisers rolled to a stop in front of my driveway, lights flashing red and blue against the early evening sky. My first thought was, finally, Karen's cracked. My second thought was, what fresh insanity has she cooked up this time? The answer came when one of the officers stepped out and ordered me to keep my hands visible. "We received a report of a disturbance," he said, his hand resting on his holster. "Caller claimed you were threatening neighbors with a firearm." For a moment, all I could do was laugh. It bubbled up involuntarily, the sheer absurdity of it overwhelming. "A firearm?" I repeated. "Officer, the most dangerous thing I've got in this house is a rusty hedge trimmer." But the call had been serious enough that they had to check. They searched my property, checked my truck, even peeked in the garage. Of course, they found nothing. No gun, no threats, nothing but half-unpacked boxes and a confused homeowner with a phone full of footage proving who the real menace was. When I showed them the video of Karen blocking the street and screaming that she owned it, the tension drained from their shoulders. One officer sighed and said quietly, "We've dealt with her before. She's persistent." Persistent. That was one way of putting it. I watched from the porch as they walked across the street to Karen's house. She was waiting for them on the lawn, hands on hips, voice shrill enough to pierce glass. She pointed at me, shouted something about danger and community safety, and waved a sheaf of papers like they were warrants. The officers listened politely, then left without so much as a warning in my direction. Karen's face as they drove away was priceless, red, twisted like she'd swallowed vinegar. The false police report might have rattled someone else, but to me it was proof of exactly how far she was willing to go. She wasn't just trying to enforce imaginary rules anymore. She was trying to weaponize the system itself, to make my life miserable by sheer brute force. But here's the thing about pulling fire alarms when there's no fire. Eventually, people stop coming when you call. The next escalation came on a quiet Saturday morning. I was mowing the lawn when I noticed a line of cars slowly rolling past my house, each driver craning their neck like they were on a guided tour. Some even slowed enough to take pictures. By the fourth car, I shut off the mower and walked to the curb. That's when I saw the sign Karen had nailed to the HOA's community bulletin board at the end of the street. It read, "Warning, registered menace lives here. Protect your children." Underneath was my address. I stood there for a long moment, stunned. Karen had officially crossed from petty harassment into full-blown defamation. When the fifth car slowed to snap a photo, I walked right up and waved. The driver looked startled, then embarrassed, muttering, "Sorry," she told us, before driving off. I pulled the sign down and tossed it into my garage, but not before taking several photos of it myself. Evidence, always evidence. Then I called the sheriff's office again. The deputy who showed up this time recognized me immediately. "What now?" he asked, sounding exhausted. When I showed him the sign, he groaned. "She's digging her own grave. Just keep documenting everything." At this point, the DA might get involved. Karen must have seen him talking to me, because later that day she marched across the street, clipboard in hand. "You can't take that sign down," she barked. "It's public information." I raised an eyebrow. Public information? Karen, it was slander stapled to a board. "You know what public information actually is? Arrest records. And if you keep this up, you'll get one." Her face twisted, but before she could launch into another tirade, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, muttered something under her breath, and stormed off. For the first time, she looked less like a queen on a crusade and more like a cornered animal. That night, the war spilled online. A neighbor knocked on my door, phone in hand. "You've got to see this," he said. He pulled up Facebook, and sure enough, there was Karen's latest campaign. A neighborhood group post titled, "Protect Our Community from the Outsider." In it, she accused me of everything from property damage to terroristic threats. She even uploaded a blurry photo of me hauling in groceries, captioned, "Caught casing the neighborhood." The comments, though, weren't what she expected. Half the neighbors mocked her. "Pretty sure he's just carrying milk, Karen." Another wrote, "This is harassment. Enough is enough." The tide was turning, and she was too blind to see it. The breaking point came a week later. I woke one morning to find spray paint across my garage door, giant red letters spelling out, "Get out." My stomach clenched, but not with fear, with cold clarity. Karen had escalated from bureaucracy and lies into outright vandalism. I reviewed the camera footage. There she was, clear as day, in her pink tracksuit and slippers, spray can in hand. She'd even paused halfway through to adjust her hair before continuing, like this was a photo op. I copied the footage onto 3 separate drives and called the sheriff again. This time, it wasn't just a deputy. A detective came with him, notebook in hand, questions sharp. I handed over the footage, the flyers, the fake notices, the Facebook screenshots, the petition, the gate footage, every scrap of evidence I'd been collecting. By the time I finished, the detective's stack of notes looked like a small novel. Karen, of course, stormed out of her house mid-investigation, screaming about conspiracies. "He's lying. He's framing me," she wailed. The detective calmly asked if she'd like to make a statement. She froze, looked at the clipboard, then muttered something incoherent and retreated back inside. The officers promised to forward everything to the district attorney. As their cars pulled away, I stood on my porch, looking across at Karen's drawn curtains. For the first time, I felt the shift. This wasn't just my problem anymore. Karen had picked a fight with the law, and the law was finally paying attention. Still, I knew her type. Backed into a corner, she wouldn't admit defeat. She'd come out swinging, even if it meant burning everything around her. I just didn't know how far she'd go, or how spectacularly she'd crash. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I watched her pacing her front yard on the phone again, hands slicing the air. A few neighbors stood at the edges of their lawns, whispering, pointing. One of them caught my eye and mouthed, "She's losing it." I nodded, but kept my expression calm. Inside, I was already preparing. If Karen's next move was as reckless as I suspected, the fallout wouldn't just end her reign over the HOA. It would shake the entire street. And I was going to be right there, beer in hand, to watch the empire collapse. The war was no longer between me and Karen. It was Karen versus reality. And reality always wins. By the time the district attorney's office began reviewing the case, the neighborhood had already split into 2 camps. Those who still clung to Karen's delusions of authority, and those who'd grown tired of her antics and quietly cheered me on. The division made Saturday morning lawn chores feel like a Cold War standoff, half the street trimming hedges in tense silence, the other half giving me discreet thumbs up when Karen wasn't looking. The strange thing was, I almost enjoyed it. Watching her unravel had become a kind of dark comedy, though I never forgot she was dangerous. Her next stunt proved that. It was a Tuesday evening, just after dusk. I was grilling on the back patio when I heard the unmistakable clang of metal on concrete. At first, I thought it was kids messing around with bikes. Then I heard chains. When I rounded the side of the house, I froze. There was Karen, hunched over my driveway, hammering a heavy steel post into the ground with the help of one of her dwindling loyalists. Bolted to the post was a shiny new sign that read, "HOA parking only, violators will be towed." For a moment, I couldn't even speak. I just stood there, tongs still in my hand, watching this middle-aged woman pound steel into property that wasn't hers. Finally, I called out, "You do realize this is my driveway, right?" Karen straightened, sweat glistening under the streetlight. "Correction," she said, pointing at the sign like it was divine law. "This is HOA property now. We voted." I barked out a laugh. "Karen, you can't just annex land by hammering signs into it. This isn't the Wild West." Her ally shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting his involvement. Karen glared at him, then at me. If you don't like it, take it up with the board. That was my cue. I pulled out my phone, started recording, and walked right up to the sign. Perfect, I said. Now I've got video evidence of you vandalizing private property. Thanks for saving me the paperwork. Her face paled. She yanked the hammer from her ally and hissed, "You're going to regret this." Then she stormed off, leaving the sign crookedly bolted into the concrete like a monument to her delusion. The next morning, I called a contractor to remove the post. It took him 20 minutes with a grinder and a crowbar. When Karen emerged from her house to protest, he waved her off with a curt, "Lady, I've got authorization from the property owner." She fumed silently, clutching her clipboard like it was a lifeline. I thought maybe that would be the climax, but Karen wasn't done. That weekend, she orchestrated her boldest move yet. I woke to find a crowd gathering at the end of the street. Curious, I wandered down, only to discover that Karen had rented a stage. A literal wooden stage, complete with a podium and microphone, set up on the cul-de-sac like she was running for president. She climbed onto the platform in her pastel tracksuit, hair sprayed into a stiff helmet, and began addressing the neighborhood. "Fellow homeowners," she declared, voice amplified through a cheap speaker system. "Our community is under attack. An outsider has moved among us, one who disrespects our rules, threatens our safety, and endangers our property values. But we will not be silent. We will not be intimidated. This is our home, and we will defend it." I stood in the back, arms crossed, listening as she whipped up her dwindling supporters into a frenzy. They cheered, clapped, nodded at all the right moments. Then she dropped the bombshell. "That is why, effective immediately, I am authorizing a special assessment to fund legal action against this menace. Every household will contribute $200 to the HOA litigation fund." The murmurs that followed were delicious. $200 wasn't pocket change, and half the neighbors were already sick of her. I saw people whispering, shaking their heads. One man called out, "You can't just make us pay for your fight with him." Karen doubled down. "This isn't my fight. This is our fight. If we don't act now, our neighborhood will collapse." I couldn't resist. I raised my hand like a student in class. "Quick question," I said loudly. "How exactly do you plan on suing someone over rules that don't even apply? Because last I checked, you don't own me, my house, or this street." Her face twisted with rage as the crowd turned toward me. "Get out of here," she shouted. "You have no right to speak at this meeting." "Funny," I said. "Because unlike you, I actually own the property I'm standing on. And I've got hours of video, dozens of witnesses, and now half the county laughing at your antics." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen sputtered, tried to rally, but the damage was done. People were murmuring openly now, some walking away. The man with the suspenders, once her staunchest ally, shook his head and muttered, "I'm not paying a dime." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Karen screamed about loyalty, betrayal, and outsiders, but her words rang hollow. By the time the stage was dismantled, only a handful of diehards remained by her side. I thought that might finally be the breaking point, but Karen had one last, desperate card to play. The very next day, I returned from work to find a tow truck. Not in my driveway this time, but hooked up to the car of the woman with 2 kids down the street. The same woman who'd told me she was sick of Karen's nonsense. I ran over. "What's going on?" The tow driver looked bewildered. She said this car was illegally parked on HOA property. The woman was nearly in tears. "It's my own driveway." That was it. I dialed the sheriff again. Within half an hour, officers were back. When they confronted Karen, she screamed about authority, waved her clipboard, and even tried to shove one of them when he told her to calm down. That was her fatal mistake. They cuffed her right there in the street, neighbors gathered on lawns, kids gaping from windows. Karen shrieked about conspiracies, corruption, betrayal. "You're all against me. I own this street. "I own it," she wailed as they loaded her into the cruiser. The crowd was silent for a moment, then someone chuckled. The chuckle spread into laughter, then applause. Even the woman whose car had nearly been towed clapped through tears. The neighborhood had witnessed the collapse of its self-appointed queen, and there was no coming back from it. I stood on my porch that evening, beer in hand, watching the last of the tow trucks drive away. The street was calm for the first time in weeks. No flyers, no petitions, no spray paint, no cones. Just quiet. It was almost eerie. But I knew Karen wasn't gone for good. People like her don't disappear. They regroup, reframe, rewrite history until they're the victim. And when she came back, she'd be louder, angrier, and even more unhinged. The difference now was that she'd lost the neighborhood. And that was a power she'd never get back. Still, part of me couldn't help but smile. Because if Karen thought she'd hit rock bottom, she hadn't seen anything yet. The true collapse was still coming. And I had front row seats. The week after Karen's arrest felt like waking from a fever dream. For the first time since I'd moved in, mornings were quiet. No flyers taped to my door, no strangers driving by to gawk, no cones or makeshift gates blocking the street. Neighbors strolled by with their dogs and actually waved, a small rebellion in itself. The air was lighter, freer. But I didn't trust it. People like Karen don't vanish. They lick their wounds, rewrite the story, and return with a vengeance. Sure enough, her pastel tracksuit reappeared 3 days later. She strutted down the street like nothing had happened, chin high, sunglasses shielding her eyes. The neighbors froze, watching. Some muttered under their breath. Others retreated inside. I stayed on my porch, beer in hand, waiting. She didn't look at me directly, but her voice carried. False charges. Misunderstanding. Police harassment. I'm filing a complaint. It wasn't spoken to anyone in particular, just broadcast into the air, like she was narrating her own absolution. Then she turned on her heel and disappeared into her house. The quiet ended the next morning. A thick envelope arrived in my mailbox, certified and stamped with the seal of a law firm 2 towns over. Inside was a letter on official letterhead. Notice of intent to pursue civil action. Karen had hired an attorney, at least she claimed she had, and was suing me for defamation, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and loss of community standing. I nearly spit out my coffee laughing. She had flipped the narrative on its head, painting herself as the victim of my campaign of humiliation. According to her, I'd doctored videos, spread lies, and manipulated the neighborhood into turning against her. The damages she demanded? $50,000 and a written apology. It was insane, but it was also clever. She wasn't trying to win in court, she was trying to bury me under stress, paperwork, and fear. She was hoping I'd cave before the first hearing. But she underestimated me. I called the number listed for the law office. The receptionist sounded confused when I asked for the attorney's name. After a pause, she said, "We don't handle cases like that. I think there's been a mistake." A mistake, indeed. I hung up and laughed. Karen had drafted the letter herself, complete with a fake signature. She'd gone from printing violation notices to forging legal threat. And I had the evidence to prove it. Still, I wanted her to overplay her hand. So I didn't confront her directly. I simply added the letter to my growing evidence file and waited. It didn't take long for her next move. The following weekend, county code enforcement returned again. This time, they weren't snapping photos. They were carrying clipboards, looking serious. When I asked what was going on, one said, "We've had multiple complaints about illegal rental activity at this address. Unlicensed boarding house, multiple tenants, safety violations." I nearly choked. Boarding house? It's me, a dog, and some flamingos. That's it. The officer frowned. "We're required to investigate." As they checked the house, I realized what Karen had done. She'd filed formal complaints under my address, hoping to drown me in red tape. But this time, her recklessness had a fatal flaw. She filed so many complaints in quick succession, illegal rentals, hazardous waste, unregistered business, noise violations, that the sheer volume raised eyebrows. One of the officers muttered, "All these came from the same person." By the time they left, shaking their heads, I knew the county was catching on. That evening, I spotted Karen pacing in her front yard, phone to her ear, gesturing wildly. Neighbors watched from porches, whispering. The woman with 2 kids muttered to me, "She's gone off the deep end. Filing fake lawsuits, calling the county every week. It's only a matter of time." She was right. But Karen wasn't slowing down, she was speeding up. 2 nights later, just past midnight, my camera pinged again. I opened the app to see Karen herself dragging something heavy into the street. At first I couldn't make it out, but as the image sharpened, I realized what it was. Cinder blocks. She was building a barricade at the entrance to the cul-de-sac, stacking blocks across the asphalt like she was fortifying a castle. When she finished, she planted a handmade sign, HOA controlled zone, no entry without permission. I stared at the footage, torn between disbelief and awe. She had officially gone medieval. By morning, the barricade was complete. Cars slowed, confused. Neighbors emerged, furious. One man yelled, "This is a public road. You can't block it." Karen stood atop the pile of blocks like a queen defending her castle. "This is our street," she screamed. "We're taking it back from outsiders." The sheriff arrived within an hour. They ordered her to dismantle the barricade. She refused, shouting about sovereignty and rights. So they brought in a county truck with a forklift, cleared the blocks in minutes, and issued her a citation for obstruction. Neighbors gathered on lawns, some cheering, some shaking their heads. I stayed on my porch, sipping coffee, watching the empire crumble one cinder block at a time. You'd think that would have ended it, but Karen's spiral was just beginning. A day later, she mailed glossy flyers to every house within 3 blocks. On the cover, my face, snapped from a distance with the words "Community Terrorist" stamped across it. Inside, a manifesto of sorts, accusing me of destroying property values, conspiring with county officials, even psychological warfare. She called for a neighborhood stand against me, urging people to protest in front of my house until I left. It was laughable. Except 10 people actually showed up. They stood at the curb with homemade signs, "Respect the HOA, protect our homes, no outsiders." They looked awkward, like kids forced into a school play, but they were loud enough to draw attention. I stepped onto my porch, filmed the whole thing, then shouted, "Wave for the camera! You're all going viral." Some scattered immediately. Others tried to hide their faces. Within 15 minutes, the protest fizzled, leaving only Karen on the sidewalk, shrieking into her megaphone about property right. That footage, too, went into my file. At this point, the neighborhood was fed up. Even her old allies stopped returning her calls. The board was in shambles. Meetings were canceled. Fines went unpaid. People were openly mocking her on social media. And yet, she clung to the fantasy like a drowning woman clutching a stone. Her final act that week was the most reckless of all. Late Friday night, I heard pounding on my door. When I opened it, 2 police officers stood there, grim-faced. Behind them, Karen hovered, arms crossed, smirk plastered on her face. "Sir," one officer said, "we received a 911 call reporting domestic violence at this address." Caller claimed there was screaming and physical assault inside. My jaw clenched. "There's no one else in this house. You're welcome to check." They did. Room by room, they found nothing but boxes, my dog, and a very confused homeowner. When they returned to the porch, I handed them my phone. "Check the call logs. She's the only one who benefits from this circus." The officers exchanged a look. One turned to Karen. "Ma'am, filing false police reports is a serious crime. We're going to need you to come with us." The morning after Karen's second arrest was the quietest this street had been since I moved in. No flyers, no cones, no fake signs nailed into posts. Just kids riding bikes, sprinklers ticking away, and the faint smell of someone grilling burgers before noon. It felt almost normal. But I didn't let myself relax. Karen wasn't the kind of storm that passed quietly. She was the kind that circled back, louder and angrier, until it either burned itself out or got ripped apart by bigger winds. Her house stayed dark for 2 days. Curtains drawn, driveway empty. Neighbors whispered about whether she'd finally learned her lesson. Some hoped she'd move away. Others speculated she was plotting her comeback. I just waited, watching her mailbox from my porch like it was a barometer. When the mail piled up without being touched, I started to wonder if she really had snapped. On the 3rd evening, though, the lights flicked on. And just like that, the circus was back. Karen stepped out with her hair sprayed into place, clipboard in hand, walking the block like nothing had happened. She waved stiffly at passing cars, called out hollow greetings, even inspected someone's hedge as if her authority hadn't been dismantled in front of everyone. It was surreal, watching someone so deep in denial that reality bounced off them like rain on a tin roof. But the neighborhood wasn't buying it. People avoided her, closed their doors, cut conversations short. Even her old allies kept their distance. She was an empress without subjects, ruling over a kingdom that no longer existed. That was when the letters began. Not the childish flyers she used to tape to my door, but thick envelopes slipped under neighbors' doors. Each one claimed she was the true victim, that the arrests were part of a conspiracy against her, orchestrated by me. She begged for donations to her legal defense fund, promising to take the fight all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. I got one too. Mine was handwritten, in looping cursive. "You have destroyed my reputation. You will pay for what you've done." No threats of violence, but the implication was clear. I added it to my evidence file and poured another beer. The real unraveling came 2 weeks later, during what should have been the HOA's annual barbecue. In years past, Karen had organized it with military precision: permits, decorations, speeches about community pride. This year, without her grip, the event was half-hearted. A few folding tables, some store-bought potato salad, a grill manned by the guy in suspenders who once carried her camera. Half the neighborhood showed up, more out of habit than enthusiasm. I wandered down, curious to see what it would feel like without Karen running the show. People were chatting, kids playing tag, actual laughter echoing off the houses. For the first time, I felt like maybe this place could be a real community. And then she appeared. Karen stormed into the cul-de-sac like a hurricane in pastel. She marched up to the grill, grabbed the microphone meant for announcements, and launched into a speech. "Neighbors, don't be fooled. This so-called barbecue is a betrayal of our values. This man," she pointed at me across the crowd, "has poisoned our unity, destroyed our standards, and turned you all against your rightful leader." A hush fell. People exchanged glances, uncomfortable. A few chuckled nervously. Then the woman with 2 kids stepped forward. "Karen, enough. We're tired. We just want to live in peace." Karen's face twisted. "Peace? Without rules, there is no peace. Without authority, there is chaos. Look around you. Trash bins left out, weeds in yards, outsiders mocking us. This neighborhood is falling apart." It was like watching someone unravel live on stage. Her voice rose to a shriek, her hands shaking as she jabbed the microphone toward me. "And it's his fault." This time, though, the crowd didn't nod or mumble agreement. They booed. Actual, honest-to-God boos. Someone shouted, "Go home, Karen." Another yelled, "We're done with you." Karen froze, stunned. She had ruled by intimidation for so long that outright rejection was unthinkable. Her mouth opened and closed, fish-like, as the crowd turned away from her. The man at the grill unplugged the microphone. Someone else guided their kids away, muttering, "Don't look, honey." Karen stood there for a moment, trembling, before letting out a scream, wordless, primal, and hurling the microphone onto the asphalt. Then she stormed off, shoulders hunched, her empire officially crumbling in the open. I thought that was the finale. I thought her reign had ended in humiliation, that she'd slink back into her house and stew until she moved. But Karen's true finale was still to come, and it was bigger, louder, and more spectacular than even I had imagined. It happened a week later, on a hot Thursday afternoon. I was in my garage, tinkering with tools, when I heard the rumble of a truck. I stepped outside to see a flatbed rolling down the street. On it was a giant steel shipping container, 20 feet long, industrial gray, with a padlocked door. The truck backed it into Karen's driveway. She stood there directing the driver, clipboard in hand, shouting instructions. Neighbors gathered, whispering, speculating. When the truck pulled away, Karen strutted up to the container, slapped the side with her palm, and shouted, "From now on, all HOA meetings will be held here. Secure. Controlled. Free from outsiders." It was absurd. A steel fortress in a suburban driveway, looming like a bunker. Kids gawked, parents shook their heads, some laughed outright. Karen didn't care. She threw the doors open and marched inside, declaring it the new command center. That night, lights glowed from within. The next morning, she'd spray-painted the words, HOA Headquarters, across the side in uneven block letters. It was the ultimate symbol of her delusion, a monument to her refusal to accept reality. The county didn't find it funny. Within days, officials arrived, citing zoning violations and safety hazard. They ordered her to remove the container. Karen refused. She locked herself inside, blasting music and shouting through a megaphone about sovereignty and rights. The standoff lasted 3 days. News crews showed up. Cameras rolled as Karen screamed from the doorway about conspiracies, outsiders, and her God-given authority over the street. The footage aired on local TV, then spread online. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just my nightmare, she was a viral spectacle. Memes flooded social media. Clips of her shouting, "I own this street," were set to dance music, auto-tuned, looped into remixes. The whole country was laughing at her. The end came when a tow company, hired by the county, arrived with a crane. In broad daylight, in front of half the neighborhood and a TV crew, they hooked the container, lifted it into the air, and hauled it away. Karen ran after it, screaming, clipboard waving helplessly. The image of her chasing her steel fortress down the street was the last straw. Neighbors erupted into cheers. Kids clapped. Someone popped a beer can and toasted. Karen collapsed on her lawn, sobbing. The sheriff's deputies guided her back inside, not arresting her this time, just shaking their heads. By sunset, her house was quiet again.